What would you do if everything you owned could fit inside a canvas sack, and the only inheritance left to you was a rusted set of tools no one else wanted? What if the only door left open was one the whole town had boarded shut and forgotten, and the only person who believed in you had already been buried in the cold ground? Find yourself a quiet spot tonight. Pull up close and settle in. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from, as we tell you the story of Cecily Holt and the abandoned boathouse at the end of Greywater Cove. Cecily Holt came back to Dunmore Landing the same way she had left it 7 years before, on foot, with the wind at her face and nothing but what she could carry. She was 22 years old, and she moved with the careful stillness of someone who had learned not to draw attention to herself. Her canvas pack sat heavy on one shoulder. Inside, a change of clothes, a wrapped loaf of bread going stale, and at the very bottom, tucked in a length of oilcloth, a set of caulking irons that had belonged to old Henry Finch. Henry Finch, who had taught her everything she knew about boats. Henry Finch, who had taken in a 12-year-old girl with nowhere to go after the fever took her mother, and had taught her to read the grain of wood the way some people read at faces. Henry Finch, who had died the previous winter in his sleep, quietly, the way good men often do, leaving behind a cluttered workshop, a lifetime of unpaid goodwill, and one apprentice who had no legal claim to any of it. His nephew had arrived from Halifax 3 days after the funeral. He had looked at Cecily with the kind of polite blankness that is worse than cruelty and told her the property was being sold. She had 1 week. She had packed her things that same afternoon. She had spent the better part of a year in Yarmouth, working in a cannery that smelled of fish oil and rust, sleeping in a rented room above a laundry. She had saved what she could, spent what she had to. And then, when she could bear the smell of the cannery no longer, and the rented room had begun to feel like a box she was being slowly sealed inside, she had turned north and walked back the way she had come. She did not have a plan. She had a direction, and sometimes that is enough to start with. Dunmore Landing was a small town on the Nova Scotia coast, the kind of place that remembered everything and forgave almost nothing. A village of weathered clapboard and lobster traps, of men who had fished the same water as their grandfathers, of women who knew whose grandmother had done what to whose grandfather before anyone currently alive had been born. It had a general store, a post office, a tavern that smelled of old smoke, and a wharf that had seen better decades. Cecily walked in along the coast road as the afternoon light turned low and golden over the water. She saw the same faces turn to watch her pass, the same slight widening of eyes as they placed her. The girl who had worked for Finch, back again, with nothing, by the look of it. She kept her gaze on the water, the same cold gray Atlantic that had always felt more honest to her than the people who lived beside it. It didn't pretend. It simply was what it was. Her one stop was to find Gus Pelham, who had run the wharf for as long as anyone could remember. Gus was a compact, brick-solid man of 60-odd years, with a beard the color of steel wool and the squinting eyes of someone who had spent a lifetime reading weather. He was splicing rope on an overturned dory when she found him. He looked up at her without surprise. "Heard you might be coming back," he said. He did not say he was sorry about Henry. He had already said that at the funeral, and a man like Gus did not say important things twice. "I need work," Cecily said, "and somewhere to base out of." Gus set down his rope and looked at the water for a moment, the way men who spend their lives near the sea do when they are thinking something through. "Work I can maybe find you. As for a place," he paused, and his gaze drifted east along the shore, past the main wharf and around the small rocky headland that broke the cove. "There's the old Hadley boathouse down at the end of the cove. Been empty 10, maybe 12 years. Town holds the deed for unpaid taxes." Cecily knew the place. A hulking structure of dark timber, half sunk into the rock of the shore, with a wide water door that opened directly onto the cove. Old Morton Hadley had used it for building fishing dories before his eyesight failed, and his sons moved away to the mainland, and his wife passed, and the whole enterprise came apart the way things do when the person holding it together is gone. "What's wrong with it?" she asked. Gus gave a short breath through his nose. "The roof has holes you could put your fist through. The water door is jammed and probably rotted through at the hinges. The floorboards on the south side are gone entirely." He looked at her with the careful expression of a man deciding how honest to be. "It's a wreck, Cecily." "I know what a wreck looks like," she said. "Can I get the deed?" He studied her for a long moment. Gus Pelham was not a sentimental man, but he had watched Henry Finch's apprentice haul and caulk and fair, a hull by the time she was 15, working with the quiet focus of someone twice her age. He had seen what Finch had made of her, and he understood that the tools in her pack were not just tools. They were an argument, Deeds with the town clerk, he said finally. Been there since old Hadley's estate settled. Back taxes come to about $40. I don't think anyone's going to fight you for it. $40 was most of what she had left in the world. I'll take a look at it first, she said, although the decision was already made. She could feel it the way you feel a change in the weather, not in your mind but somewhere lower, in your chest. It was the only door that had opened. She would walk through it. Gus offered her the use of his spare skiff to get around the headland to the cove, and she took it without ceremony. It was a small, wordless kindness, the best kind, offered without drama or expectation of thanks. She rowed around the headland as the sun began its drop toward the tree line. The cove opened up before her, sheltered from the main harbor, its water dark green and still. And there, at the far end, built directly into the rock shelf of the shore, was the Hadley boathouse. It was worse than she remembered. The roofline sagged in the middle like a broken spine. Several of the upper wall planks had sprung loose and hung at angles, letting in strips of pale sky. The water door, two massive timber panels that swung outward to allow a boat to pass through, was canted badly on one side, where an iron hinge had rusted through and given way. The dock that ran alongside was missing planks in 3 places, like a smile with teeth knocked out. A skin of green moss and barnacles covered the stonework at the waterline. Cecily shipped her oars and let the skiff drift. She sat in the quiet of the cove and looked at the boathouse for a long time. The cold despair came then, the way it always does when reality finally catches up to the idea. She had spent almost everything she had saved, a year of fish oil and cramped hands and early mornings, on the idea of this place, and the idea had been so much more bearable than the reality. A herring gull landed on the sagging roofline, regarded her with one flat eye, and lifted off again. The water sloshed softly against the skiff's hull. She thought of Henry Finch, not of his voice or his face, exactly, but of the way he had stood in his own workshop the first time she had entered it, all those years ago. He had looked at a pile of green lumber and bent copper rivets and a hull frame warped by 3 wet winters, and he had said perfectly calmly, "Well, that's where we start. Not where we wish we were, where we start." She picked up the oars. The town clerk the following morning was a thin man, with a careful manner, who seemed faintly surprised that anyone was interested in the Hadley boathouse, but counted her money slowly and filled out the deed with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who had nothing else pressing. He handed her the paper across the counter with a look that sat somewhere between neutrality and pity. "The roof will need significant work," he offered. "Yes," Cecily said. She folded the deed and put it in her coat pocket against her chest. She walked back out into the cool October morning. She had the deed, she had the tools, she had perhaps $12 left to her name, a borrowed skiff, and a building that was slowly becoming part of the rock it sat on. The news moved through Dunmore Landing by the afternoon, the way news always moved in small towns, faster than any person carrying it. The girl who had worked for Finch had bought the old Hadley wreck down in the cove. $40 for a boathouse that was halfway to being driftwood. She heard the comments in the general store while buying nails and rope, and a new draw knife to replace one of Henry's that had snapped at the tang. She'll flood out by November. Can't even swing a hammer, girl like that. What does she know about boat building? Finch taught her to caulk. That's not the same as building. She paid her bill without acknowledgement and carried her supplies down to the dock where she had tied up the borrowed skiff. She was tying the last bundle when a man's shadow fell across the dock boards. She looked up. Raymond Calder, who owned the largest fishing operation in Dunmore Landing, sat in a lacquered trap boat, idling just off the dock. He was a broad man, thick in the shoulder, with the reddish face of someone who spent too much time outdoors and did not let the outdoors humble him. "Cecily," he said, the name flat and brief. "I heard you bought the Hadley property." She said nothing. She kept tying. "I offered the town $15 for it last spring, just for the timber and the iron fittings." He spoke loudly, the way men do when they want an audience to hear a point being made. "You paid nearly 3 times that for a wreck." She straightened and looked at him directly. "Yes." He seemed to have expected more than that. Her flatness threw him off for a moment. "I'll give you 20 for the deed right now. Save yourself the trouble." "No." He studied her the way a man studies something he can't quite read. "It'll take more than a caulking iron to fix that place, girl." She picked up her supplies and stepped into the skiff. "I expect it will," she said, and pushed off from the dock. She heard him mutter something to his deckhand as she rowed away. The words carried across the water, "Fool's errand" and "Finch's charity case." But by then she was already past the end of the dock, and the water was between them. The anger that had started as a small cold thing in her chest burned now, clean and useful. Good. She would need it. She was halfway down the cove when she noticed the old woman sitting on the rock shelf at the boathouse end, mending net with the unhurried precision of someone for whom time has stopped being a pressure. She was Mira Boudreau, who had lived in the same house above the cove for at least 40 years and was said by some to be 80 and by others to be well past it. Her family had fished these waters before the English had a name for the province. Cecily had not spoken to her in years, but the old woman lifted her head as the skiff came in, and her dark eyes held no distance in them at all. "That building has been waiting," Mira Boudreau said, not as a greeting exactly, but as a statement of fact. Cecily tied up the skiff. "Waiting for what?" The old woman looked at the boathouse. "For someone who knows what it is." She looked back at her net, her fingers moving without her eyes needing to guide them. Wood remembers the hands that shaped it, even old wood. Then she returned to her mending, the conversation apparently complete. The words were strange, but they settled in Cecily's mind and stayed there. Wood remembers. She had heard something like that from Henry Finch, in a different form. He had said that a good boat builder doesn't impose a shape on the wood. You find the shape that was already in it. She pulled her supplies up onto the rock shelf and went through the side door of the boathouse into the dark interior, for the first time as its owner. The smell hit her first. Salt, rot, old tar, the mineral cold of stone. Light came through the holes in the roof and the sprung wall planks in thin gray bars, illuminating drifting motes of dust and the general state of disaster. The floor on the south side was indeed gone. Just open stone and water where planks had given way to decades of damp. The great wooden cradle in the center of the building, where a hull would have sat during construction, was still intact. A massive structure of timber, and the only thing in the place that looked like it had been built to last. Everything else was a question of degree of damage. The workbench along the north wall was soft with rot. The timber-framed walls were sound in most places, but would need replanking extensively. The roof, she climbed the internal ladder and looked, was a serious problem. Several rafters had cracked under the weight of accumulated snow and had deflected badly. 2 of them would need to be replaced entirely. She stood in the cold half-light of that ruined space for a long moment. Then she took Henry Finch's caulking iron from her pack, the heaviest one, the one he had used for a final pass on a seam, and she set it on the workbench, just to put something of his in the space. To make it say, "This is where we begin." The days that followed became a kind of punishment she chose deliberately. She started with the roof, because the roof was the only argument that mattered. If the building stayed wet, nothing else she did would hold. She stripped the old cedar shingles one by one, piling them on the rock shelf outside. The rotten wood came away in her hands. The sound rafters she sistered with new timber she bought on credit from the yard in town, negotiated with the quiet stubbornness of someone who has no leverage but refuses to show it. The cracked rafters she pulled and replaced. She worked from first light to last, coming down from the roof only when she could no longer see what she was doing. Her hands bled. Her shoulders ached with the particular deep ache that only comes from overhead work sustained across many days. At night, she slept in the dry corner of the boathouse near the old hull cradle, wrapped in her bedroll, listening to the sound of the cove water moving against the outer wall. It was a mournful sound, but it was also rhythmic, and rhythm, she had learned, was a kind of company. She ate little and worked constantly. When Gus Pelham rode over one afternoon on a thin pretext and handed her a pot of his wife's pea soup without a word, she ate it in 4 minutes sitting on the floor and did not cry, though the warmth of it in her hands was enough to make her chest ache. Slowly, the roof came right. New shingles, properly overlapped. The rafters trued, the ridge cap sealed, then the walls. She pulled the sprung planks, let them dry, and renailed the ones that were still sound. The ones that had gone soft she replaced with new board, working with the draw knife to fair the surface, the steel moving in long curling strokes that she had learned to make without thinking. It was the kind of work that had a meditative quality to it when you knew what you were doing. The mind emptied out, the hands knew the way. One morning, working on the north wall near the old workbench, she noticed something she had missed in the first chaotic days. Behind the bench, where the timber of the inner frame met the stone of the exterior wall, there was a gap. Not from damage, but from construction. It had been deliberate, and wedged inside the gap, wrapped in tarred canvas that had kept it from the damp, was a long, flat package. She worked it out carefully and brought it to the light. Inside the canvas was a roll of papers, architectural drawings, done in pencil on heavy drafting linen, with a precision that made her breath catch. They were plans, hull plans, 4 different designs, all for fishing dories, each one annotated in a small, cramped hand, with notes on timber selection, fastening schedules, the depth of the keel rabbet, the rocker of the bottom, and on the cover sheet a name, Morton Hadley, 1931. Boat builder, Dunmore Landing. Cecily sat on the stone floor with the plans across her knees and read them cover to cover. She had known Morton Hadley only as a name attached to an abandoned building. What she held in her hands was something entirely different. He had been a designer as well as a builder, and a precise and thoughtful one. The dory plans were elegant, not the heavy sea dories of the traditional design, but something refined, with a finer entry and a slightly different stem curve that she recognized instinctively would make the boat faster and drier in a following sea. He had annotated the changes carefully, noting the reasoning behind each departure from convention. There was also a 4th drawing, the largest, that was not a dory at all. It was a small schooner, not a working vessel, too fine for that, too considered. Something meant to sail well for the pleasure of sailing. He had labeled it simply, Greywater. Cecily unrolled the schooner plan and studied it for a long time. It was unfinished. The hull lines were complete and the framing schedule was laid out, but the notes stopped partway through, as though he had been interrupted and never returned. She rolled the plans carefully and set them beside Henry Finch's caulking iron on the cleared section of workbench. Wood remembers the hands that shaped it. She was not building a boathouse, she was completing an argument. The weeks became a month, and the month stretched into November with its gray skies and the cold that came off the water with teeth. Cecily worked the building methodically, section by section. The south side floor she replaced entirely, cutting new timber to length, setting the joists on new stone sleepers, bedded in hydraulic lime. The water door, the great pair of timber panels that opened onto the cove, she took apart piece by piece, assessed what could be saved and what could not, ordered new copper-riveted hardware from the marine supply in Lunenburg, and rebuilt them. The new door, when she swung it open for the first time on its new bronze hinges, moved without a sound. Gus Pelham stood on the dock when she swung it open, and he did not say anything, but he took his hat off and held it for a moment which from a man like Gus was equivalent to a standing ovation. She worked on the old hull cradle, tightening the joints and replacing the bearing pads. She rebuilt the workbench on the north wall in new timber, fair and level. She organized Henry Finch's tools on a new rack above it, each one in its place, the caulking irons hanging in order of weight. And then, quietly and without announcement, she began to build. She started with one of Morton Hadley's dory plans. The simplest, a 14-footer. She ordered timber from the yard, white pine for the bottom and sides, spruce for the thwarts, a slab of white oak for the keel. She worked from Hadley's annotations as though they were a conversation, his penciled notes answering her questions before she thought to ask them. The work was slower now, more deliberate, more satisfying. A hull growing on the cradle is a different thing from repair work. There is a direction to it. Each day she could see the shape emerging, the way a form emerges from a block of stone under a patient hand. Dunmore Landing noticed. People found reasons to walk along the cove road past the boathouse, through the open water door. She kept it open when the weather allowed for the light. They could see the hull framing taking shape on the cradle. Word moved through the town with a different quality now, no longer laughter but something more uncertain. The winter that year was hard. The first serious storm came in from the northeast in early December, a 3-day blow that kept the fishing fleet in harbor and drove icy rain horizontally against every surface. The harbor was rough enough to break 2 moorings and push a trap boat up onto the wharf. On the second night of the storm, Cecily was banking the fire in the small iron stove she had installed in the corner when she heard something above the noise of the storm, a sound underneath it, irregular. It sounded, she thought, like a person. She went to the door and pushed it open against the wind, and the rain drove at her face like needles. She held her lantern up. The cove was black, the water wild, but at the far end of the dock, barely visible, was something that did not belong in the water. It was a punt, a tiny, flat-bottomed boat, and it was swamped, mostly submerged, held by its mooring line against the dock piling. In it, or rather clinging to the piling beside it, was a man. He was shouting something she could not hear over the wind. She did not stop to think about it. She pulled on her oilskin, took the coil of line from the hook by the door, tied one end to the bollard inside the boathouse, and went out onto the dock. The rain was blinding. The dock moved underfoot with the surge. She went hand over hand along the dock rail, paying out line behind her, until she reached the man. He was 50 or so, weathered and shaking, wearing nowhere near enough clothing for the conditions. He had been in the water at least partially, and his lips had gone a color that frightened her. "Can you walk?" she said, directly into his ear. "Aye," he managed. She put her arm under his and they came back along the dock together, her line their only certain connection to the shore. The 30 meters back to the boathouse took a very long time. Inside, she got him near the stove. She had a spare blanket which she put over his shoulders. She heated water and made strong tea. She wrapped his hands around the cup and watched his color come back slowly, the way dawn comes in winter, reluctantly. His name was Francis Teal, a lobster fisherman from 2 coves over. He had been caught out in his punt checking a wayward trap when the storm had worsened faster than he expected. His punt had swamped in the run-in to the cove. He had managed to grab the dock piling and hold on. He sat by her stove for an hour, coming back to himself. He looked around the boathouse with the practiced eye of a man who knew what things were supposed to look like and could see the quality of the work. His gaze moved from the rebuilt walls to the fair floor, to the hull framing on the cradle, to the tools on their rack. "You did all this," he said finally. "Not a question." "Most of it," she said. He looked at the hull framing for a long time. "Is that a Hadley plan?" "It is." Something shifted in his expression. "I knew Morton Hadley, a long time ago." He was quiet for a moment. His dories were the best handling boats on this coast. "I know," she said. "I found his plans in the wall." Francis Teal looked at her then, really looked at her, with an expression that was not pity and was not patronizing. It was the look of someone who has just understood something. "He kept them in the wall," he said softly, "all this time." When the storm blew itself out the following afternoon, she helped him rig a line to his swamped punt and they bailed it together. He was steady on his feet now, color back in his face. He wrung her hand at the dock. "I owe you more than I can say," he told her. "Go home to your family," she said. "That's payment enough." But Francis Teal was not a man to let a debt hang, and in Dunmore Landing, where people talked, the story of that night spread to every kitchen table and every front porch within a week. They spoke of the young woman in the old Hadley boathouse, who had gone out into the storm on a line and brought a man back from the water. They spoke of the hull on the cradle inside, and the open water door and the rebuilt walls. The laughter had entirely stopped. One morning in late January, a knock came at the boathouse side door. Cecily opened it to find Dr. Fraser, the town's physician, a careful, quiet man in his 60s with the thoughtful manner of someone who has learned to observe before speaking. He was not a man you would expect to be standing in front of a boathouse. "Miss Holt," he said, "I hope I'm not interrupting." She stepped back and let him in. He looked at the interior with the deliberate attention of a person who does not miss details, moving from the repaired structure to the workbench, to the hull framing, saying nothing until he reached the plans pinned to the board above the bench. "Morton Hadley," he said, reading the cover sheet. "Where did you find these?" she told him. He listened with the particular stillness of someone for whom information has just changed the shape of something they thought they already knew. Then he said something she had not expected. "I have a patient," he said carefully. "A man who fishes on his own, no family nearby, who cannot afford a new dory. His current boat is no longer safe." He looked at the hull on the cradle, then at her. "Would you be willing to discuss it?" She was. By March, the first dory was finished. It went into the water at high tide on a clear, cold morning, and it floated with the clean, level stance of something that had been thought through rather than merely assembled. Gus Pelham was there. Mira Boudreau was there, her dark eyes bright. A small gathering of people from the town who had made their way along the Cove Road, for reasons they had not clearly articulated to themselves. The dory moved out onto the Cove water and sat in it perfectly, and there was a long silence of the kind that settles after something true has happened. Raymond Calder did not come himself, but he sent his head dockman with a question. Could Miss Holt build 4 dories for his operation to the same plan? She sent back a price that was fair and a timeline that was honest. He agreed. Spring came to the cove with the smell of cold soil and salt. The boathouse was fully repaired now and fully occupied, the hull cradle busy, Morton Hadley's plans in constant use. Cecily had ordered a second set of timber, and Gus Pelham's nephew, a young man of 16 who had expressed an interest in the work, had started coming by after school to learn the basics of fairing and fitting. She was teaching him the way Henry Finch had taught her. Without ceremony but with precision, the tools placed in his hands and the knowledge of what to do with them, following close behind. One evening, when the light had gone gold over the cove and the water was the color of old copper, she sat on the dock with Mira Boudreau, who had come down from her house with a thermos of strong tea and taken a seat on the dock as though she had been invited, which she had not needed to be. Dr. Fraser had been down that afternoon, working out the specifications for a second dory commission. The first had served his patient so well that word had moved beyond the town. Cecily had shown him Morton Hadley's unfinished schooner plans for the first time, and he had studied them with the same reverence that he gave to the botanical prints in his surgery. The Greywater, he had said. He never built it. Not yet, Cecily had said. Now she sat on the dock with Mira Boudreau, and the two of them looked out over the cove, at the boathouse with its water door standing open, a light warm inside where the second dory was taking shape on the cradle. He kept them in the wall, the old woman said, as though she had been told the story already, though Cecily had not told her. Perhaps in Dunmore Landing, all the walls eventually said what they held. He kept them in the wall, Cecily agreed. The old woman was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And you were the one who's listened for them." The town that had written her off as Finch's charity case, that had watched her buy a ruin for $40 and laughed into their coffee, did not call it the Hadley wreck anymore. They called it Holt's Boathouse. And when strangers came down the coast road asking about where to have work done on a boat, the direction they were given was simple. Go around the headland, into the cove, follow the sound of the tools. In the evenings, sometimes when the work was done and the fire was banked and the tools were on their rack, Cecily would take Henry Finch's heaviest caulking iron down and hold it for a moment before putting it away. Not from sentiment exactly, but from something that did not have a better name. It was a conversation with a man who had shown her how to hear what a building or a hull was trying to say. Not through the wood itself, but through the quiet attention you had to bring to it. She had come back to Dunmore Landing with a canvas sack and a set of inherited tools and a door that had not even fully opened yet. She had not built the boathouse into what it became. She had built herself into someone patient enough to hear what it needed and to answer. What has someone left you? A tool, a skill, a quiet piece of knowledge that the world told you was not worth much. We would love to hear your story in the comments below. And if Cecily's journey moved something in you tonight, please share this with someone who might need it. We will be here, by the hearth, whenever you are ready to come back.